Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're opening up a really crucial file from modern history. It's a specific moment, often talked about, in shorthand, but one that truly defines the path towards the partition of the Indian subcontinent.
That's right.
We're diving deep into the sources around the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. Our main guide here is the very meticulous analysis in Zahir Ahmad Mir's Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan.
Absolutely. And for you listening, our mission today, it's complex, but it's really essential. We're not just, running through historical events. We need to forensically analyze this one episode. Think of it as the constitutional pivot point. It was the final, incredibly detailed and carefully negotiated attempt to keep a united India together, using a specific legal architecture.
Right.
It's really the story of a constitutional bridge, one built with immense difficulty, accepted conditionally by everyone involved, and then, well, because of some very specific political statements, it was immediately and irrevocably burned down.
Yeah, and the context here is just critical, isn't it? We have to set the stage. We're talking spring 1946. World War II is finally over. Britain is, frankly, exhausted financially, militarily.
Drained.
And the global pressure, plus intense local agitation in India, it just made the demand for freedom irreversible. The British government, desperate, really, for an orderly transfer of power, sent this top-level delegation, the Cabinet Mission. 3 high-ranking cabinet members. Their job, find a workable plan.
Yeah, find something that sticks. And what really stands out in the source material is how Muhammad Ali Jinnah approached this whole thing. The text frames it less as just another round of politics, haggling.
Right.
And more as his last legal effort to avoid the trauma of partition. He was looking for an enforceable guarantee.
An enforceable one. That's
exactly. Well, he was asking, could we secure complete constitutional safeguards, real autonomy for Muslims within a single unified framework? Could we make that work legally so we don't need outright separation? He was acting less like a politician just demanding Pakistan and more like a constitutional lawyer, rigorously testing the validity of a contract designed specifically to protect minority rights.
So he wasn't just posturing, he was looking for an ironclad legal mechanism, something so robust that even the overwhelming numerical majority of the Congress in a unified India couldn't just dismantle it later.
That's the core of it.
And that takes us right into the proposal itself, the blueprint the mission came up with. Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly was the structure? How was this Cabinet Mission Plan supposed to work as this viable, if fragile, compromise?
Understanding the architecture is absolutely key to understanding why it failed. On paper, it was hailed as, an intellectual masterpiece.
Right.
Designed specifically to achieve unity without imposing uniformity. Yeah. The kind that centralized power inevitably demands. It set up a really unique 3-tier federation, something quite new. Yeah, crafted specifically to balance that need for some central authority, for essential functions with the Muslim League's absolute demand for deep regional autonomy.
Okay, 3 tiers. That immediately suggests decentralization, doesn't it? Can we, walk through those levels?
Yeah.
Especially how little power that top tier, the Union, was actually supposed to have.
Absolutely. Let's start at the top. Tier 1 was the Central Union, and its power was deliberately, incredibly minimized. Skeletal, really.
Skeletal.
Yeah, it was limited to only 3 very specific, non-negotiable subjects: defense, foreign affairs, and communications. That's it.
Just those 3?
Just those 3. Critically, all other subjects think about crucial areas like finance, taxation, education, health, social policy, economic planning. All of that was reserved for the lower tiers.
Okay, hold on. That's the core insight for you listening right there. If the Union couldn't really tax widely or control internal finance, how strong could it actually be? The sources suggest the League's big fear was always a central government using finance to, coerce the provinces.
That's exactly right. The architects of the plan, they understood this fear deeply. By limiting the central government to only those 3 areas, basically the bare minimum needed to function as a sovereign state. On the world stage, they intended to make the center too weak to oppress anyone, majority or minority. It was designed as a structural antidote to that fear of majority rule, just swallowing regional identities and cultures. The center would exist, basically, to handle international stuff and common security. Nothing more.
But the real constitutional innovation, the part that was supposed to really satisfy the Muslim League, provide those necessary safeguards, that was in the 2nd tier, wasn't it?
It was, absolutely. The true innovation, the constitutional core of the whole plan was Tier 2, The provincial groups. This was revolutionary.
Revolutionary how?
Because the formation of these groups was intended to be mandatory. The provinces, based largely on geography and, demographics, were to be divided into 3 compulsory groups.
Compulsory, okay.
And these groups, not the weak central union, would control their own common subjects. And crucially, they'd set their own regional constitutions. This effectively turned the country into something more like a loose confederation than a tight federation.
Right. And the sources, they detailed the makeup of these groups, because that must illuminate the strategic calculation for the League.
Right, precisely. The groups were defined very carefully. The idea was to allow regional Muslim or Hindu majorities to manage their own affairs without interference from the central majority. Let's break them down.
Yeah.
Group A was the big one. It had the Hindu majority provinces in the center and south, Nagras, Bombay, UP, Bihar, central provinces, Orissa. This was, the bulk of the Congress political heartland.
Okay.
Then Group B. This encompassed the northwest Muslim provinces, Punjab, Sindh, Baluchistan, and the northwest frontier province, NWFP. This grouping was critical. It aggregated the maximum possible Muslim demographic strength in the northwest, basically the core area that would later become West Pakistan. And finally, Group C. This comprised Bengal and Assam in the east. Now, this group was fascinating. Bengal had a clear Muslim majority, Assam a Hindu majority. But the grouping mechanism was designed to allow the joint legislative body of these 2 provinces to establish regional control, giving maximum autonomy, especially to the large Bengali Muslim population.
So these groups, they essentially act like subfederations, managing everything from, say, internal security to economic development, anything not covered by defense or foreign policy.
Pretty much, yeah.
And then Tier 3 was just the existing provincial governments underneath them, keeping their local autonomy. It sounds less like one country and more like maybe a kind of European Union model.
That comparison is actually quite apt. The provincial governments would still have powers, yes, but the grouping structure was designed to aggregate power regionally, to allow these regional political blocs to function without constant fear of the center overriding them. The whole system was fundamentally a structural compromise, and it was built entirely on one absolutely critical assumption,
Which is
that if the central government was kept sufficiently weak and the regional groups were sufficiently strong and unalterable, then unity could, just maybe, be preserved.
unalterable. That seems key.
Absolutely fundamental.
And that brings us back to the core conflict this whole structure was trying to solve. The Muslim League wanted, essentially, a federation of equals, ironclad safeguards for Muslim-majority areas. Congress, on the other hand, fundamentally sought a strong, centralized India. So this 3-tier system was the specific attempt to bridge that chasm by radically limiting the central power while keeping the map of India, the political geography, united.
It was the ultimate constitutional tightrope walk,
Yeah.
a really delicate balancing act. And the success of the entire plan rested on one non-negotiable principle: the absolute legal inviolability of that grouping system.
Right.
If the groups could somehow be dissolved later, or if the central union's very limited powers could be expanded down the line by the majority,
Yeah.
well then the entire structure failed to provide security. And if it failed on security, it failed to satisfy the Muslim League, period.
That structural necessity, that need for inviolability, leads us directly to part 2, calculated acceptance. Because here's where it gets really, really interesting.
Yes.
Despite the Lahore Resolution already being out there, solidifying the demand for a separate state for Pakistan, the Muslim League initially accepted this plan, which seems like a massive deviation from their core political goal. Why? Why did they do that?
This is where we have to really analyze Jinnah's deep commitment to legal process, as the source suggests. The acceptance happened on June 6, 1946.
Okay, June 6.
And the sources emphasize this wasn't seen by him as a political retreat, not at all. It was framed as a constitutional experiment. Jinnah was essentially saying, look, show me an enforceable legal document, one that genuinely guarantees autonomy and security for Muslims within India, and I will forego partition.
But hang on a second. Is the source maybe overstating Jinnah's willingness for unity here? I mean, given how strong the Pakistan demand had become, how can we be sure this wasn't just a tactical move? Accept a really complex plan, maybe knowing the Congress would balk at it and thus prove that cooperation was impossible, make Congress look like the unreasonable party.
That's a critical question. And it requires careful balancing, looking closely at the source's interpretation. Political strategy was undoubtedly involved, of course it was.
Sure.
But the text strongly suggests that Jinnah's immediate goal here was testing the absolute limits of constitutional solutions first. By accepting, he achieved two things at once. First, yes, he demonstrated genuine flexibility to the British, to the world, saying, look, we prefer unity if security can be genuinely guaranteed.
Okay.
Second, and perhaps more importantly from his perspective, he gained immense leverage because the acceptance wasn't unconditional. It was explicitly subject to interpretation, ensuring real autonomy for the Muslim groups.
Ah, the fine print.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was placing the constitutional ball squarely in the Congress's court. It was their move now.
So the acceptance wasn't a surrender of the demand for Muslim security at all. It was more like a high-stakes legal gamble.
Precisely.
He was testing every single legal avenue available to see if any constitutional solution existed that could protect his community's rights without demanding full separation.
That's the argument. If the grouping system, especially the mandatory nature of groups B and C, held firm, legally unchangeable, well, that meant the massive majority in Group A, which was Congress territory, could never impose its will on the other regions in all those matters reserved for the groups.
Right.
Jinnah's acceptance was totally contingent upon the legal inviolability, the absolute sanctity of the document itself. The sources frame this as his final attempt, his last go at securing enforceable guarantees for Muslim rights within a united India. If that guarantee proved weak or could be undone, the whole plan was worthless to him.
And we really have to stress again that grouping clause, particularly its mandatory nature, was the specific mechanism designed for security. If Group B had to stay together, the Muslim provinces of the Northwest could negotiate and act as a single, powerful bloc. But if provinces could just opt out easily whenever they wanted, then the whole structure would dissolve, wouldn't it? Punjab and Bengal would be left isolated, facing the massive numerical majority of Group A alone.
Exactly right. The mandatory grouping was the absolute necessary precondition for the League's acceptance. If that mandatory nature was undermined, even slightly, the League had zero reason to accept the weak Central Union, because that protective layer, the groups, would just vanish.
Okay.
So this conditional agreement, this legal bridge, as the source calls it, it held together for, what, mere weeks?
Mere weeks. Which leads us straight into part 3, the breakdown of trust. Because the consensus just shatters almost immediately. That legal bridge wasn't just, weakened or compromised, it was demolished by a specific series of statements. So what precise actions, what declarations led to this immediate and terminal collapse?
This is it. This is the definitive turning point in the history of partition. And it revolves entirely around one single crucial question: constitutional sovereignty versus the sanctity of a fixed compromise.
Okay.
The League accepted the plan, believing it was a non-amendable treaty, negotiated with the British, setting the unchangeable terms for the future constitution. Congress leaders almost immediately and very publicly declared that the groupings would not be binding on the future sovereign body of India.
Wow, not binding. That declaration directly nullifies the very mechanism, the only mechanism, that secured the League's conditional acceptance in the first place.
Precisely.
So the core issue wasn't really the complex wording of the plan itself. It was about the nature of the body that was supposed to draft the future constitution, the Constituent Assembly.
Indeed.
Yeah.
We need to be absolutely clear about this Constituent Assembly. How it was formed is critical.
Yeah.
It was to be elected by the existing provincial legislatures.
Right.
And because seats were allocated proportionally by population, the Assembly would be inevitably overwhelmingly dominated by Congress representatives from the Hindu-majority provinces in Group A.
A huge majority.
Huge. Now, for Jinnah, the Constituent Assembly was meant to be merely a body convened to implement the agreed-upon plan, a drafting committee, essentially.
Okay.
But for Congress, it was something far more fundamental. It was the sovereign voice of the Indian people, beholden to no prior agreement, not even the one that created it.
Two completely different views of its power.
Totally incompatible views.
And the specific event, the moment that delivered the fatal blow, according to the sources.
We have to focus on the precise details here. It centers on a press conference given by Pandit Nehru on July 10th, 1946. This was soon after he took over the presidency of the Congress Party.
July 10th. Okay.
When journalists questioned him about the cabinet mission plan, Nehru stated, very publicly, that the Congress was committed to nothing beyond entering the Constituent Assembly. And this is the killer line, that the Assembly would be sovereign to modify or change any clause of the cabinet mission plan.
Any clause. Let's just pause on that statement for a second. Sovereign to change any clause? That's not just, political rhetoric or tough talk. That's a direct constitutional threat to the minority safeguard, isn't it? Why did Jinnah view this specific claim of sovereignty as, well, constitutional betrayal and not just hardball politics?
Because from his legal perspective, it completely dismantled the League's core defense, the entire basis of their acceptance. If the Constituent Assembly was truly sovereign, and if it was numerically dominated by Congress, well, it meant the majority could simply vote to abolish the mandatory nature of Groups B and C. They could vote to expand the powers of the deliberately weak Central Union. These were the very fears the plan was meticulously designed to prevent.
So Jinnah's logic must have been something like, wait a minute, we accepted this plan because we were told it was a fixed contract, preventing you, the majority, from taking absolute power in the center and dissolving our group autonomy. But now, by claiming the right to amend that contract the moment we convene, you prove that the contract offered us absolutely no legal security whatsoever.
Exactly that. The source material really emphasizes this was the moment the illusion of security just dissolved completely. For Jinnah, the plan was a legal compromise, a constitutional treaty between two major political entities and the British Crown. Treaties are supposed to be fixed documents. They establish parameters. If one party, especially the majority party, claims the right to unilaterally rewrite the treaty terms immediately after signing it, well, then the entire agreement is rendered meaningless, non-existent. The legal foundation was just gone, vaporized.
We should probably explore the specific constitutional clauses that were most at risk here. The sources suggest the League was particularly fearful about the ability of individual provinces to just opt out of the groups, right? Can you elaborate on that specific fear?
Absolutely. That was a major point of contention. Take Group C, for example, Bengal and Assam. The Congress-led government in Assam was deeply, deeply resistant to being grouped with Muslim-majority Bengal. They feared Bengali domination.
Okay.
Now, if the Sovereign Constituent Assembly ruled that provinces had the immediate right to opt out of groups before the regional group constitution was even set up, well, Group C would disintegrate instantly. Assam would pull out, likely remaining under strong central influence via Group A, leaving Bengal isolated. Similarly, in Group B, the Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, which actually had a Congress-affiliated government at the time, might well have voted to opt out of the grouping with Punjab, Sindh, and Balochistan.
Right.
The mandatory nature of the grouping was the protection. The threat to allow immediate opting out, backed by the claim of assembly sovereignty, was the demolition crew aimed right at that protection.
So Nehru's statement, perhaps unintentionally or perhaps strategically, essentially confirmed the League's deepest suspicion that in any unified democratic structure based purely on population, the numerical majority would always reserve the ultimate legal right to legislate away minority protections whenever it suited them.
It boiled down to a fundamental conflict between two legal philosophies, two constitutional worldviews. One side, Congress, saw the Constituent Assembly as the paramount expression of national will, national sovereignty, bound ultimately only by its own decisions. The other side, the League, saw the Constituent Assembly as a body with delegated authority, specifically bound by the preconditions, namely the Cabinet Mission Plan, that authorized its very existence. Once that latter view, the view of the Assembly being bound by the plan, was publicly rejected by the leader of the majority party, well, the basis for unity just evaporated. There was no common ground left on the fundamental rules.
Connecting the dots then, the League acted swiftly, decisively even, once they perceived that this legal bridge was not just compromise, but actually fraudulent from their perspective. What did their withdrawal actually look like?
It was very clear. On July 29, 1946, just 19 days after Nehru's pivotal press conference, the All India Muslim League Council met in Bombay.
Okay, end of July?
They passed a resolution formally withdrawing their acceptance of the Cabinet Mission Plan. Full stop. But crucially, they didn't just withdraw. They simultaneously passed another resolution, a very famous and controversial one, announcing Direct Action Day set for August 16th, explicitly to achieve Pakistan.
Right, Direct Action Day, a major escalation.
It signaled a definitive shift, away from constitutional negotiation, which had now failed in their eyes, towards mass political agitation on the streets. The source calls this date, July 29th, the precise moment the last constitutional bridge collapsed.
It really does feel like the moment of no return, doesn't it? The failure of this intricate plan solidified partition. It moved it from being, a political demand or a negotiating position to becoming an absolute constitutional necessity in the eyes of the Muslim League leadership.
And that leads us right into our final section, Part 4. From compromise to absolute conviction. The shift here, it's important to stress, wasn't portrayed as purely emotional or reactive in the source. The sources emphasized that Jinnah's conviction for separation became absolute because it was backed by a constitutional conclusion, a conclusion reached after the failure of meticulous negotiation. So how did this specific failure redefine the League's ultimate objective?
Well, if we follow the rigorous legal logic presented in the source, Jinnah, the constitutional lawyer, had now tested every conceivable legal structure for unity within India. The three tiers, the deliberately weak center, the mandatory groups. He had examined them all. And he found that none of them, in his assessment, were truly enforceable against the potential actions of a numerically superior constituent assembly claiming absolute sovereignty.
The conclusion, from that perspective, was grim but ironclad. Any legal guarantee offered to the minority could, and likely would, eventually be legislated away by the majority, all under the perfectly legal guise of constituent assembly sovereignty. The risk of the majority changing the fundamental terms after the agreement was made, well, that risk was deemed absolute, unacceptable, intolerable.
So the objective had to be completely redefined, didn't it? If even this highly decentralized form of unity couldn't provide guaranteed, enforceable, and crucially unalterable legal security, then the only remaining alternative was complete separation. Sovereignty.
Correct. The new objective became immediate and absolute. Only a separate sovereign state, Pakistan, could guarantee justice and freedom as they defined it. It wasn't necessarily the preferred outcome initially, according to this analysis, but it became the necessary outcome.
A realization, then, that the kind of legal mechanism required for their security simply did not exist within the structure the majority party, Congress, envisioned, or more importantly, would respect the limitations of.
Exactly. The source material, particularly in Chapter 8, titled Last Chance for Unity, makes this point very forcefully. The failure of the Cabinet Mission Plan wasn't just a political breakdown. It proved, fundamentally, that the two core political visions for the future of the subcontinent were just irreconcilable.
And what were those irreconcilable visions again, just structurally speaking?
Well, Vision A, championed primarily by Congress, prioritized a strong, unified, centralized state. Even if the central powers were initially limited by the plan, the inherent right of the Sovereign Assembly to potentially expand those powers later was non-negotiable for them. This reflected, a desire for national strength, national unity, perhaps above deep regional autonomy.
Okay. And Vision B?
Vision B, the Muslim League's absolute insistence was for a structure defined by guaranteed, unalterable autonomy for the Muslim majority groups, prioritizing group security, minority rights over centralized power. They needed the Constitution to be rigid, legally watertight, precisely where it mattered most for their protection.
So when those guarantees, that rigidity, were shown to be vulnerable to unilateral change by the Constituent Assembly, the constitutional path for unity was just closed forever.
Yes. The failure wasn't just a political disagreement blowing up. It was a deep structural breakdown of constitutional trust. The mechanism failed its purpose before it was even built.
This failure, therefore, it served as the ultimate proof point, didn't it? Leading directly, and quite logically from their perspective, to the Lahore Resolution's practical fulfillment Pakistan. It became the necessary constitutional outcome of a meticulously designed negotiation process that was actually intended to avoid it.
It became, in the specific words used by the author Mir, the restitution, not rebellion, but restitution. It was framed as the necessary legal move when all lesser legal avenues, all attempts at compromise within unity, failed to secure the minority's constitutional position and safety.
This has been a really fascinating and incredibly detailed deep dive into what was actually a very short but profoundly consequential period of history. Let's just quickly try and recap the crucial points for you listening today. We started by dissecting the Cabinet Mission Plan's, elegant, but ultimately very delicate three-tier structure, designed for unity without uniformity. And we stressed how the mandatory nature of the provincial groups was the absolute key safeguard in that structure.
Absolutely. And then we analyzed the Muslim League's highly calculated and pointedly conditional legal acceptance of that plan back on June 6, 1946. It was presented as a genuine test. Was security achievable within a united framework? But that test hinged entirely on the plan being treated as a fixed, unalterable constitutional treaty.
Right. And most critically, we focused on the immediate shattering of that fragile trust, specifically by the assertion of the absolute sovereignty of the Constituent Assembly, epitomized by Pandit Nehru's statement on July 10, 1946.
Yeah.
That declaration effectively dissolved the legal guarantees upon which the League's acceptance rested. And that, in turn, forced their withdrawal just weeks later on July 29th. This whole episode, this historical moment, it really represents the final painstaking effort to preserve unity through law, through constitutional design, and its collapse solidified the path toward partition.
That intricate legal architecture, it failed the ultimate constitutional stress test. Could it provide unalterable security to the minority? Once that guarantee was proven in their eyes to be vulnerable to the political will and legal power of the numerical majority, well, there was simply no going back to the concept of a united India. The trust was broken.
And that profound synthesis brings us right back to our source, Zahir Ahmad Mir. He provides this really powerful closing insight, which is worth repeating. When the last constitutional bridge was burned, Pakistan rose from the ashes of failed unity, not as rebellion, but as restitution of equal rights.
It forces us, and hopefully you listening, to reflect deeply on a really fundamental question of constitutional governance. It's one that echoes globally, really, in every diverse federation or state with significant minorities. If a majority power, acting through its sovereign representative body, can legally overturn the foundational guarantees of a prior compromise agreement, if the terms of security agreed upon are subject to legal revision by the numerical majority almost immediately after the deal is struck, does that render all the prior negotiation, all the constitutional effort, essentially meaningless for the minority? What are the implications for group rights, for minority security, when the very mechanism designed to provide enforceable autonomy can itself be legally dismantled post-agreement by those holding the majority vote? That crucial, difficult question is what this deep dive leaves with you to explore further.